Welcome to video number 11 on John Rawls and the difference principle. Very often when we talk about Rawls, you'll hear the phrase veil of ignorance associated with his philosophy instead of the difference principle. I'll try and show you why I think the difference principle is a better way to describe it, but we'll also plunge into what the heck is the veil of ignorance and how does it apply to Rawls' philosophy. Quick review of the previous video, actually two of them, John Stuart Mill and the short video on agape. Both of those, importantly, each gave us a new way of thinking about an ethics dilemma. How should we approach it from the mindset of John Stuart Mill? How should we approach the dilemma from a mindset of agape? And you're probably tired of hearing me say this. That can be so useful from a leadership and a critical thinking perspective to be able to come at a really thorny personal and or professional problem from all these perspectives and to have these different viewpoints at your fingertips, each one ideally leading to a possible set of solutions through this dilemma that you've encountered. Anyway, I think you have heard that before from me. The key points of video 11 on Rawls and the difference principle, his concept of justice, that's probably the big word associated with Rawls, and it leads to his difference principle. We're also going to briefly talk about the veil of ignorance, the difference principle, and significant for our application of Rawls to ethics dilemmas, his three areas of inequality that he has identified. Let's get some background on John Rawls first. And I'll confess, he's one of my favorites. I want you to think for yourself, but I find Rawls' thinking and his ideas about justice and how we can use those ideas to approach an ethics dilemma, I find those very attractive. Rawls, 20th century American philosopher. He was born in 1921, died in 2002, darn him. He is generally recognized, and this is certainly debatable, but generally recognized as one of the greatest, if not the greatest, philosophers of the 20th century. And it's largely because of his thoughts on justice, what justice is, why it's important, and how we seek justice. And he was very interested, I think this may have some appeal for many of you, very interested in social justice. His feelings of justice over the course of his career, I don't think they changed, but they grew. His first great claim to fame really was a book in 1971 called A Theory of Justice, where he explained his ideas about how justice should be distributed and achieved in a society. But in 1971, he called this a moral doctrine. He said we should seek justice because it's the right thing to do. And again, I think that's going to resonate with many of us, but I can already feel myself pushing. You think for yourself on this. In our course, Rawls is just another hat you try on or a lens that you look through as you're trying to solve an ethics dilemma. And all of us are going to prefer some of those lenses to others. But Rawls began with a very moral, and that's his word, standpoint. He saw justice as a moral doctrine and a moral mandate. Near the end of his life, he wrote another book, and this would be the one I would recommend if you're interested in Rawls. He said this was his last statement, his refinement of what he meant. You can see it was published in 2001, right before he died. That book is Justice as Fairness. And by his own admission, we start to see, I think, more of the influence of a philosopher named David Hume there. And one of the attractions of David Hume is that he wasn't starry-eyed about anything. Hume said, we seek justice in our own self-interest. We seek justice to protect our own property, And then he said, and for some of us, that becomes such a ritual, such a habit, that it becomes a value all in its own. So it can be kind of a moral thing, but also a self-interested thing. And Rawls, I think, grew to a fuller understanding of that near the end of his life. In Justice as Fairness, his 2001 book, he says that seeking justice is the politically expedient thing to do to preserve your status in a property owning democracy. I think it's important to note that Rawls did not give up his idea that justice was a moral doctrine and a moral mandate. I think he increasingly saw justice, however, as a way of achieving social stability in an increasingly contentious democracy. And I think he saw selling justice as a self-interested concept might have appeal to some people who did not see it as simply a moral qualification. So Rawls saw both angles there. One reason I think I find this so interesting is if you go back to our concept of indirect reciprocity, Rawls' thinking on justice is very similar to this, that not only does it become a good thing to do, you remember indirect reciprocity is helping other people with no expectation of return. Most of us would argue that's not only a good thing to do, but it's a self-serving thing to do. Indirect reciprocity proves that those rewards circle around and come back to us. And I think Rawls is saying the same thing with justice. It's the right thing to do, but hey, you'll win if you do it. I think there's that strong similarity between Rawls and indirect reciprocity. Well, if we're going to talk about Rawls and justice, we have to get to what is his definition of justice. Thank goodness he's not Plato. If you're familiar with Plato's Republic, that big, fat, contentious book, that whole book comes from someone saying to Socrates, "Hey Socrates, what is justice?" And 9,000 pages later, Rawls can be wordy and pretty hard to follow, but he's got a pretty clear definition of justice. Rawls says that justice, I'm looking at our first bullet here, is a characteristic, meaning characteristic of a particular society, a characteristic set of principles for assigning basic rights and duties and for determining the proper distribution of benefits and burdens of social cooperation. He packs a lot into that definition, but he gives us a shortcut. He says that justice is fairness. And we've already talked about different ways to describe Rawls, the difference principle, the veil of ignorance. I think the one he would have preferred to describe his whole philosophy, and it's uncharacteristically simple, simply stated for him, our last bullet here, justice as fairness. Again, that's the title of his last book, and what Rawls believed was the clearest, strongest statement of his philosophy. Rawls further believed that there were two basic principles of justice, and these are important because they lead us to his concept of the difference principle, which is going to be highly useful to us in resolving ethics dilemmas. These principles of justice come from a thought experiment, more on this in just a bit, that Rawls designed that's now known as the veil of ignorance. So these principles don't come out of nowhere. And in the second part of our Rawls lecture, part 2, I'll get into a little bit where these principles come from, his fascinating veil of ignorance thought experiment. But let's just take these on faith, if you would, right now. Rawls says that there are two basic principles of justice, that if we could design our own system for a society that's full of inequalities, these are the rules we would design. He says the first principle of justice, basically, this is my own rewording of his principles, is everyone should have equal basic liberties. Just as the liberties we need to function in what he calls a property-owning democracy, Nobody gets more liberty than anyone else. His second principle is that positions that have extra powers and benefits should be equally open to all. And now we run in head first to the inequalities in society. Some people are born with unearned advantages. It's no disgrace to them, no shame on them, but we live in a society, and I'm going to take us into controversial territory here, where within some cultures, some races seem to be favored over others unfairly. Some genders seem to be favored over others unfairly. Some people get advantages in those areas that they did nothing to earn. So let's look at our first sub-bullet here under point number 2. People with those positions that have extra powers or benefits, need to use those positions. They must use them to benefit the least advantaged, the people who didn't get those arbitrary advantages. And Rawls even says that the least advantaged need to see the benefits of allowing the most advantaged to hold those positions. In other words, let's say I'm somebody who didn't get some of those arbitrary advantages. I might wish I had them so I could get access to those positions that have extra powers and benefits. But I can't get there right now because, in part, let's say, because of these arbitrary and unfair advantages that went to other people. I need to see the people that holding those positions. I need to say, well, I wish I held those positions, but I don't. She does, whoever this she is. And gee, I wish I held that position, but I'm glad that she does, because I can see that she is using that position to address and to try to redress the unfairness of my position. I hope that's clear. We'll keep coming at this idea from different angles, and it's important because this is what Rawls calls the difference principle. So, what are these right now mysterious, unfair, arbitrary advantages that some people get and some people don't? Rawls focuses on 3 areas of unearned advantages in life. And I'm going to confess right now, you can probably hear me struggling to avoid the word disadvantage. Some of these unearned advantages, and here we go into controversial territory again, I think it would be a generally fair statement to say that white males maybe were born with some advantages because of those 2 qualities that other people don't have, people who do not have those characteristics. Please think for yourselves on this. My concern is that I don't want to use the word disadvantage for people who are not white and male, because that sounds so pejorative and that there's something wrong with that. So if you hear me stumbling and struggling and staying a mile away from the word disadvantage, you're hearing correctly, because I've got a multitude of flaws, but I would never say, and I don't believe, that non-male genders, that's some kind of disadvantage. I'm just saying that there are some cultures that don't favor all genders and races equally. And I'm stumbling already. Rawls says that there are 3 areas where some people gain. Remember, his concept is justice is fairness. Some people gain an unfair advantage. And he says that those are, look at the top half of our slide here. These are his exact words: social advantages. And by that he means the initial social position. What kind of family were you born into? If you were born into a family with loving, nurturing parents and it's upper middle class, that's certainly an advantage in our culture. And, no shame on you, but you did nothing to earn that. It just happened. So that's an area of unearned advantage that some people get and some people don't. His second category there, that second sub-bullet, he calls natural unearned advantages. And he also talks about native endowments. And he's largely talking about genetics there, not exclusively, but largely talking about genetics there. What kind of health were you born with? What ethnicity, because some do unfairly get favored over others in access to positions of power. What gender, same deal. Some genders do get favored over others in pathways to power. Although, again, please do think for yourself here. I'm not asking you to completely agree with me on this. I'm not here to preach. His third bullet is here's Rawls' penchant for, big words and complex names for what he's talking about. Fortuitous contingencies. And all he means by that, and bless his heart, he does say this later, good luck or bad luck, especially over the course of a lifetime. So I think there's an easier, not quite as accurate, but a much easier way to get at what Rawls is talking about this. And this is the second half of the slide. Let's just say for our class, the three areas of unearned advantages are genetics, just those biological things we're born with, health, gender, and we can argue is that biological or not, race, ethnicity, and etc. Things that loosely defined relate to genetics. Secondly, luck, and again, particularly but not necessarily over the course of a lifetime. And then this last one, social status at birth. What were you born into? Um, I think it's easier to understand that second set of terms. And here we go, my lazy intellect. We can use the acronym GLASS to remember Rawls' three areas of unearned advantage. The G in GLASS for genetics, the L in GLASS for luck, the A, I guess, is for and the SS is for social status. And you'll just have to remember at birth. But these are the three areas that Rawls focuses on where some people get some advantages that other people did not receive. In his Justice as Fairness book, his by his own admission, his last best effort to explain what he meant by the concept of justice as fairness, Rawls keeps chasing the difference principle and restating it, trying to bring us to a clear understanding of what he's talking about here. And in that book, different ways he comes at the difference principle is to say those with unearned advantages in our three areas, remember the acronym GLASS, in the three areas must help those who didn't get those advantages. Otherwise, the existing inequalities are not permissible, they're not fair. And we can help those people individually. We also can help those people, and I'm saying we, let's say we're a group with unearned advantages. We can help the less advantaged individually. We also can work to build a society where those advantages that seem unfair get redressed. Why should anyone be born into poverty? Can that be addressed and redressed? Why should one gender, in terms of pathways to power, be favored over others? Can that be addressed and redressed? So it can be kind of a global cultural effort. It also can be an individual effort. Bottom line is the people that got those unearned advantages shouldn't be beating themselves up. They're not bad people. They just got an unasked for head start in the race, and for reasons we'll get to in just a moment, ought to help people who didn't get that head start. Next bullet, Rawls says the more advantaged are not to be better off at any point at the expense of the less well off in terms of those advantages. That's the worst thing he can think of, is that the more advantaged are actually taking advantage of the lesser advantaged. Remember the title of his book, Justice as Fairness. You can imagine how Rawls feels about that. So, bottom line here, the underlined sentence, and this is my way of describing it, not necessarily Rawls's. Um, Rawls means that the winners of life's lottery need to help those who didn't win. And why is that? Well, in his last book, Justice is Fairness, he says that this is essential for social peace, for avoiding social unrest. That we live in a culture where communication grows every day. Everyone knows what everybody else is doing. It becomes clearer to the people who did not get those arbitrary advantages. It becomes clear to them every day how unfair the situation is. And they may not sit still for that unfairness. I don't think I would. Think for yourselves, my favorite thing to say. Um, and so we should enact the difference principle. The people with those advantages should enact the difference principle simply to kind of hold on to what they've got to maintain social peace and not lose everything in some kind of cultural war or civil war. Um, Earlier in his A Theory of Justice book back in 1971, again, Rawls flat out says this is a moral doctrine. This is the right thing to do. That's going to resonate with a lot of us. But Rawls gives us more than one reason for enacting the difference principle. And then something we'll get to in the second Rawls video. He says that if we could just design a social contract, if we could all sit down together before we enter this culture, and we know there's going to be inequality in this culture we're about to enter, and we're not sure where we'll end up in all that. He says if we could design a social contract before we entered that culture, we'd come up with something like the difference principle, which wouldn't punish initiative and success and ambition and hard work, but it also would seek to, this phrase I'm overworking, address and redress the unfairnesses that throw obstacles in the way of people trying to achieve those pathways to power. Okay, let's bring the first Rawls video to a conclusion with this clear realization. Rawls' big idea for us is the difference principle. Just as Aristotle gives us Aristotle's arrow, as Immanuel Kant gives us the categorical imperative, we get another idea from Mill, we get another idea from Agape. Rawls brings us the difference principle. And I think it's important to remember on this that Rawls is an advocate of what he calls property-owning democracies. So I hope this isn't seen as an anti-democratic ideal. It is not meant to prevent people from enjoying the rewards of the well-earned rewards of hard work and initiative and putting the nose to the grindstone. Again, he just asks us to realize that some people got a head start in the race, so to speak, to achieve those things. And in a just society, for all those reasons we just saw, that's something we ought to fix. So as we go to the second Rawls video, probably there are two questions for us. Where did this idea of the difference principle come from? And how do we apply it to ethics dilemmas? And partly answering that in the next video is going to take us into Rawls' weird and wonderful and strangely named idea of the veil of ignorance.